Hello everyone, and welcome to this first presentation on figurative language. This is just going to be a brief introduction to figurative language, what it is, and we're going to look at the most common types that can be found in texts. We're going to look at an example of each, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail because there will be a part 2 to this video series on figurative language in which we will look at more detailed examples of figurative language, look at it at the next step, if you like. So, let's get on with it. First of all, let's define it. What is figurative language? Well, basically, figurative language is whenever a writer is describing something by comparing it or looking at it from the perspective of something else, that is figurative language. Whenever the writer isn't being literal, whenever he doesn't say exactly what he means, or rather means exactly what he says, you can say that he is using figurative language. On the screen now, you can see all the different, well, no, not all the different, but the most common different types of figurative language that you are likely to run into in most of the texts that we will be reading in class. Imagery, simile, metaphor, alliteration, personification, onomatopoeia, hyperbole, and idioms. So there are more types of figurative language, but these are the most common ones. So the first one that we're going to look at is imagery. Imagery is any type of language that the writer uses to describe any of the basic 5 senses. So whenever a writer is describing a beautiful view or a concert, or perhaps a character who is feeling emotionally heartbroken, or describing anything that is being eaten, a banquet, or the smells of a kitchen, that would be him using or her using imagery. Basically, he's describing what the readers can see or hear or touch or taste or smell via the medium of the book that they are reading. So that would be imagery. The next one is a simile, and simile is basically whenever the writer compares something to something else using like or as. You can see in the example on the screen the muscles on his brawny arms are as strong as iron bands. Obviously he isn't really as strong as iron, but the simile is used to describe that the weightlifter is actually rather strong. A metaphor. A metaphor is basically a simile, but without the use of like or as to make the comparison. Whereas a simile would say that something is like something else, a metaphor just says that something is something else. So in the example on the screen, you can see the road was a ribbon wrapped through the desert, implying that the road was long and windy, cutting through the middle of the desert. Alliteration. An alliteration is whenever a consonant occurring at the start of the word or within a word is repeated. You see alliteration used very commonly in things like tongue twisters. The example in the screen makes it fairly obvious. She was wide-eyed and wondering while she waited for Walter to waken. Obviously, the alliteration here is in the letter W. Personification. In a personification, we essentially assign a human characteristic to an animal or an object or an idea or anything, really. Whenever a writer assigns human actions to other objects, you can say that the writer is using a personification. You can see this quite often in things like the wind whistled or whispered through the trees, or a forest of masts inside a harbour, implying that there are a lot of masts in the harbour, thus many boats. So, at any point where human characteristics are given to something non-human, the writer is using a personification. Onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia is a literary technique used quite commonly in comic books. Whenever a word is used to describe or mimic a sound, then the writer is using onomatopoeia. So you often see it in comic books with the use of terms like kaboom, pow, whack, wallop. But it's also used in other terms such as whistle or drip, drip, drip. These would all be examples of onomatopoeia. A hyperbole. A hyperbole is essentially a exaggerated exaggeration. It is an extreme exaggeration done to emphasize a point. Whenever somebody over exaggerates, for example, my girlfriend called me 1,000,000 times last night, or I've told you 1,000 times, or I'm so full I could explode. These are all examples of hyperbole, an exaggeration basically aiming to make a point. Idioms. An idiom is a rather complicated beast. It is a use of language or a construction or an expression in which you cannot really translate it directly into any other language. It's just a grouping of words which make complete sense in their own native language, but when moved over as concepts, they actually make no sense. A good example would be the term, she has a bee in her bonnet. This basically means she is obsessed with something, and you can't really translate that into any other term. Other examples would be it's raining cats and dogs. Again, this is an idiom. We all understand that it means that basically that it's raining very heavily, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there are cats and dogs falling from the skies. So, that concludes this presentation on figurative language. I hope you found it informative, and I will be uploading the part 2 as soon as I possibly can.